You're listening to the Leading Healthy Creative Teams podcast with Matt Curtis. This is the podcast that helps you take your creative team from wherever you are today to healthy and effective.
Have you ever left your boss's office knowing that you weren't on the same page? There isn't much more demoralizing than that for creative. And from the other side, your boss feels it too. Communicating effectively with creatives can be tricky, especially if you aren't a creative yourself. Getting on the same page feels impossible. On the surface, it may not seem like a big deal. So my boss says, I want a font with flim-flams instead of calling them serifs. Does that really matter? From what I've seen in over 20 years of creative ministry, yes, it actually matters a lot because language is the key to growth. Sure, non-creatives can deliver feedback on projects. And it's like, I want a different color or I like this font better. But it's rare that a non-creative can go deeper than that, which means it's really hard for non-creatives to develop the creatives that they manage. Obviously, it doesn't make sense for the creatives in your organization to get an MBA, just like it doesn't make sense for your executive pastor or your business administrator to get an art degree. It just isn't a practical way to bridge the gap between creatives and non-creatives. And this is where the tension lies. If making your non-creatives more creative isn't the answer, then what is? Better language is the answer. Specifically the 4 creative cores. This is a framework of language that I developed to help bridge the gap between creatives and non-creatives serving in the church. The 4 creative cores are systems, skills, heart, and imagination. Today, I want to talk about how the 4 creative cores can help creatives grow. And it doesn't matter if you consider yourself a creative or not. The 4 creative cores were developed specifically to bridge this gap either way. Both as a creative leader and as a creative, I continued to find that my contentment and the contentment of the creatives I served always went back to one thing: growth. When we weren't growing, we were grumpy. I've found that effective creatives are the ones who have a balance across all 4 cores. When things aren't balanced, it reveals where the creative needs to grow. The real power in the 4 creative cores is in how it equips non-creatives to help identify these growth opportunities. It looks something like this in action. Your boss says this: "It seems like we've been missing deadlines lately. Do you think there's a problem with our systems?" The creative responds, "You know what? I think the issue is actually in skills. I've been trying to stretch myself quite a bit lately, and the last few projects, it's caused them to be late." Then the boss responds, "Great observation. Let's rein in the stretching of our skills right now so we can get back to hitting our deadlines." Most non-creative bosses wouldn't be able to identify the actual problem in a situation like this, let alone in a few sentences. Instead, there'd be frustration about missed deadlines, and the creative would leave the office understanding there's a problem, sure, but not quite sure what to do to actually solve it. So here's the win. When we have common language, we can start talking about growth in meaningful ways. And when the creatives are growing, they last in ministry. And when creatives last in ministry, they can help move forward the mission of your church. Now, I know what you're thinking. 4 words have the potential to change everything in my creative team. It's a pretty big claim. Look, I get it. You're right. It is. But let me tell you about what these 4 words do, and then you make the call. And you decide if this is something that will help you and your creative team. The first thing that the 4 creative cores does for you and your creative team is it streamlines discovery. I love using deadlines to explain this. A project misses its deadline. Why? Is it because the designer doesn't have a good way to keep track of the project details? Is it because the ministry leader didn't turn in content on time? If it's either of those, you have a systems problem. Is it because the designer's taking too long on the project? Maybe they don't know how to use their tools efficiently. Or maybe is it because the designer is coming up with a really complex solution and it's just taking a really long time to execute? Well, if it's either of those, you have a skills problem. Is it because ministry leaders are frustrated with other ministry leaders and they're passive aggressively taking out their frustrations through the creative team? I mean, I've seen it before. Is it because the creative team is frustrated with the ministry team? And so they keep putting their project on the back burner. If it's either of these, you have a heart issue. Is it because the designer spent days trying to find inspiration? Is it because the ministry leader rejected 20 ideas? If it's either of these, you have an imagination issue. I've seen every single one of these things happen over my time in creative ministry. I know how to find the root cause in these situations just because I've served in creative ministry for a really long time. But if you haven't, these simple situations of we are missing deadlines can actually be impossibly complex to solve. The 4 creative cores lets you focus your investigation into the problem. But streamlining discovery is only the first superpower of these cores. The second thing the 4 creative cores does is it invites collaboration. Even if you know where to begin discovering the root of the problem, a non-creative will still struggle to find answers without help. This framework lets you invite creative experts into the conversation to help them identify the problem with you. The boss has their set of expertise. The creative has theirs. The 4 creative cores function as the team-up invitation. Think back to the example that I shared earlier. It seems like we've been missing deadlines lately. Do you think there's a problem with our systems? In this situation, many leaders will respond in one of 2 ways. They'll either assume that they know the root of the problem, we keep missing deadlines, you need to keep better track of your projects. Or they'll disengage from problem solving altogether. We keep missing deadlines, you need to figure out what the problem is. Where the 4 cores is deceptively powerful is that it dismantles both of those approaches, and it instead invites collaboration. This approach will help you solve problems faster and better while also strengthening the relationships on your team. The third thing the 4 creative cores does is bring clarity. Because you're able to diagnose the root problems whenever an issue surfaces with your creative projects, everyone knows exactly what needs to be addressed and worked on. I don't think I have to go too deep into how clarity is helpful in a situation like this, but I will say the last major benefit of the 4 creative cores benefits a lot from this clarity. The last thing that the 4 creative cores does is it reveals a pathway to growth. When you have a problem in your creative team, it's a sign of an imbalance. It could be that your systems need to be addressed. Something isn't working right on project intake. Maybe your project management tool is too clunky and nobody uses it. Growth in that situation would look like watching tutorials on how to get the most out of your project management tool, or researching a different service that might actually work better for you. It could be that the skills on your team need attention. The creatives aren't able to pull off what they're hoping to, or projects are taking a really long time to complete. Growth in that situation could look like signing up for a service like Skillshare, or maybe even finding a creative coach. It could be that heart is an issue. Maybe there's been a long history of a poor working relationship, either between creatives and non-creatives in general, or maybe a specific team member. Maybe one of the teams that you work with is having issues internally, and those issues are actually expressing themselves through the creative team, through the way that they manage projects. Growth could look like having some direct conversations, exploring what's going on. This is where I've seen the 4 creative cores work powerfully. It can reveal that there are relational tensions that need to be addressed. It could be that imagination is an issue. Maybe your creatives are having a hard time coming up with new ideas for projects, or the ideas that they are coming up with are just not well received by others. Growth in this situation could look like introducing a new brainstorming meeting where you invite idea people, even if they're not formally a part of the creative team. The real power of the 4 creative cores comes to life when you're able to create a next best step for your team, whether you understand the nuts and bolts of everything that creatives do or not. And now the best next step is up to you. If you recognize an opportunity for the 4 creative cores to help your creative team, I want to encourage you to go to healthycreativeteams.com. I have an assessment there. It's free. It's 24 questions, and you'll get a result that identifies how your team's doing, how balanced you are across the 4 cores. Once you have that, go to lunchtimeheroes.co and click on 4 creative cores. It's a link up in the top. Here you'll find an overview of the 4 creative cores, as well as some podcasts that I went through in season 1 that really go deeper into each core. This is my hope for you, that the 4 creative cores transform the way that the creatives and non-creatives on your team interact, and that this is a catalyst to a meaningful growth for the creatives on your team.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Leading Healthy Creative Teams. This podcast is just one of the ways Lunchtime Heroes helps build healthy creative teams in the church. Stay up to date on the latest by signing up for the Creative Bites email at lunchtimeheroes.co.